We could see, as the Russian-Ukrainian support effort begins to decline, is a collapse of the Russian forces. We know that alcohol consumption is a big problem in the Russian army. Morale is at an all-time low. Leadership is not good. There could be an event where Ukraine achieves a significant breakthrough in a matter of days, which causes a rout and a massive withdrawal or surrender from the Russian forces.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And today we are talking to Nicholas Drummond. Nicholas is a former army officer and specialist in land warfare. He has 20 years experience in the defence industry and is the UK strategic advisor on the British Army's newest all-terrain armoured transport vehicle, the Boxer. He's also a respected defence analyst and strategic consultant. Nicholas, welcome to Frontline. Thank you so much. And today we're going to use your expertise to talk through some of the footage that we've been able to obtain from the front line. In the last few days, Ukraine has captured the town of Robotyne, and we've seen footage of Ukrainian troops using Western equipment in this battle. Let's have a little look, first of all, at the use of the Bradley infantry fighting vehicles used by Ukraine's 47th Mechanized Brigade in Robotyne. So Nicholas, what do you notice when you're looking at this footage?
Well, it reminds us how brutal and visceral land warfare still is. There's a real human element that remains constant in warfare. You can't make an omelette without cracking eggs. And in warfare terms, that means the sacrifice of human lives to achieve strategic objectives.
And when you look at this, can you actually interpret anything about the tactics that Ukraine has used in retaking Robotyne?
But what they do suggest is that the Ukrainians are conducting traditional combined arms warfare using tanks, IFVs, and artillery using artillery to bring infantry very close to the objective and then debussing from their IFVs very close to the objective and literally using rifle and bayonets to dislodge the enemy from their positions. So very much traditional warfare.
Can you tell us a bit more about the Bradley fighting vehicle and how it's being used in this kind of warfare?
So basically, the Bradley is an infantry fighting vehicle that carries 9 personnel. It carries a crew of 3 and 6 dismounts. So the commander and gunner will fight the vehicle using the cannon, a 25mm Bushmaster cannon, and the crew, the infantry dismounted team will be in the back. And they will move as far forward as they can using the cannon to suppress the enemy. It's also fitted with 2 TOW anti-tank missiles, so good for suppressing or defeating enemy armour as the vehicle advances. And then when it gets close enough, the infantry will debuss onto the objective and take out the position. And obviously you need a large number of those to take out an enemy position. And of course, Ukraine only has a limited number, so we'll be reliant on other armoured vehicles.
The Times has reported that Ukrainian soldiers use their armoured vehicles to drive right up to the Russian trenches before launching an assault. Is that something that they've learnt from NATO, or is it homegrown tactics?
I think a bit of both. You obviously want to get as close as you can because the longer the infantry have to assault on foot, the more vulnerable they are, not only to their own artillery, which will be firing as they approach the enemy objective, but also to enemy direct fire, defending their position. So you really want to debuss as close as you can to the enemy position. And of course, what's important about the Bradley is it's very well protected. We've seen a number of them taken out, but very few crew members have been injured or killed riding in that vehicle. So very well protected and very capable.
You say a number have been taken out. What does it take to disarm a Bradley?
Well, a standard anti-tank missile, RPG-29, or even enough RGP-7s will be enough to neutralise a Bradley. So, and of course, they'll have tanks dug in, which will be using direct fire to deflect the attack, so T-72s or whatever. And the Bradley can't really withstand that kind of firepower. So they can withstand certainly cannon fire, but not big tank gunfire, which is being aimed at them.
You say that the Bradley, they need more Bradley vehicles, not enough, and they're having to rely on other ways. What kind of options do they have in being able to create enough numbers, given that they are lacking in those vehicles?
So we've seen the Ukrainians use Striker 8x8 vehicles, which are like the UK Boxer, and they've used 4x4 MRAPs, all manner of those. And also they've had the UK CVRT, the Scimitar, and Spartan vehicles. And basically they'll be using anything they can to bring infantry forward using protected mobility. So for the initial stages, they'll be using the vehicles that offer the maximum amount of protection. So vehicles like Bradley, supported by Leopard Tanks, or Challenger indeed. And then they'll bring in the MRAPs that will unload the other infantry units.
These are the mine resistance ambush protected vehicles.
Exactly, yeah.
I mean, obviously, the minefields are proving a major obstacle. Just the plethora of them and keeping the advance extremely slow. I just wanted to look now at some footage of Ukrainian troops clearing minefields with Western vehicles. So this is from Ukraine's 36th Separate Infantry Brigade in Huliapol on the front. Just to talk through what you're seeing here, if you would, please.
So what they're using is something like the UK's Viper or Python mine clearance system. And this is like a modern equivalent of the old World War II Bangalore torpedo. So you fire this explosive line and basically it clears a channel through a minefield, usually about 100 to 200 meters in depth and about 30 meters in width. And that will enable the troops to advance reasonably safely through that gap.
And how important are Minesweepers to Ukraine's war effort?
Oh, the manoeuvre support that is needed to clear a minefield like this is absolutely essential, and it's the one thing that Ukraine has not had enough of. And the problem with these minefields is not just that there's so many, but they're so deep. In some cases, they're a kilometre deep. So you need to do this 5 times before you can create an effective breach through which a force can pass. And all that time, those units trying to force that breach will be under attack, under fire. So it makes them very vulnerable. It makes it very difficult. And that's why artillery is very important. And there was a big discussion about the use of different kinds of munitions, particularly cluster munitions, because these have a large number of bomblets, which can also be very useful in clearing minefields. Although we haven't seen that here, Ukrainians have used cluster munitions extensively to clear minefields, and they can create a large path through. So this kind of exercise is difficult, time-consuming, and very costly in human terms. And
time-consuming, you say. I mean, just how long does it take, for example, I just pull a figure out the air, like to move a kilometre forward?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer because it depends on the level of resistance you encounter. But, it could probably take a day, literally in some areas where there's very stiff resistance. Every guy you move forward, is taken out. You then have to bring someone else forward, another vehicle. We saw photographs on Twitter of a number of Ukrainian vehicles taken out in trying to clear a path through a minefield. There were 7 or 8 vehicles, and they will have to have been recovered and towed back. And new vehicles will have to have been brought forward, and that takes time. So ideally, you want to do this under cover of artillery, but the supply of artillery shells is finite. So you have to plan these operations very carefully. Often you'll try to do it at night when the enemy will be less alert and reliant on night vision devices.
Western supplied Leopard tanks have also been filmed fighting in Robotyne. We have some limited footage of that. Let's have a look at that now. So this is footage released by the Ukrainian army. Can it tell us anything about the way that Leopards are being used?
So this looks like a Leopard 2. That's a 120mm gun firing, highly effective at taking out other tanks. but also it will fire high explosive shells in the direct fire mode to take out bunkers. And so these will be providing direct fire support for assaulting infantry and will be very important in that role. The Leopard can absorb a huge amount of punishment. It has very thick frontal armour. And there was a report released a couple of days ago showing a Bundeswehr colonel responsible for training the Ukrainian forces with Leopard, saying that no Ukrainian soldier had been killed riding in a Leopard tank. The Ukrainians have got a fair quantity now, both Leopard 1 and Leopard 2. The Leopard 2 is obviously a quantum leap above the older Leopard 1. Highly mobile, agile, and a very capable tank, as is, of course, Challenger 2 and the Abrams that they'll soon be getting. And these tanks will be providing that intimate fire support, neutralizing enemy tanks as well, and will be instrumental in taking that ground.
In terms of the Challenger tanks and the equipment that's been supplied by the West, how much input are they having in terms of helping maintain those vehicles?
So Ukrainians have been very dependent on the companies that make the Leopard tanks to support them and Challengers. So Rheinmetall and KNDS will both be supporting those tanks. I mean, the good thing about the Leopard tank is that there are around 4,000 in service in and around Europe. So there's a very plentiful supply of spare parts. So the OEMs will be drawing those spare parts and creating logistical hubs where the tanks are brought back to be repaired or fixed when battle damage occurs. And I believe those bases will either be in Poland or just inside Ukraine, where they are well protected from Russian offensive action. So that will be going on an ongoing basis. And the good thing about Leopard is it's designed to be easy to repair and look after. It's a very reliable, well-engineered tank. I advise the people who make it, and having seen it very closely, it's an awesome bit of equipment and very well suited to the kind of warfare that it's undertaking.
And as winter and autumn and then winter approach, what kind of considerations need to be made by the Ukrainians in terms of what they will or will not be able to use, and do they have to adapt their equipment for that?
Well, we've just seen how the mud is just incredibly thick, and so you really need vehicles that can negotiate that mud, or else they are restricted to moving down roads, which obviously makes them very vulnerable. And so you want vehicles that have very wide tracks. So something like the Arctic vehicle, the BVS-10 Viking that the British Army uses, would be a very useful addition to the Ukrainian Army. Or the CV-90 IFV, which again has very wide tracks, is good at negotiating snow. So you'll definitely need tracked vehicles more than wheeled vehicles because they have a lower ground pressure. And of course, the UK Scimitar CVRT family, which we've now retired, has a very low ground pressure, and we've donated a lot of those to Ukraine, and that will be very useful in those conditions.
And just taking a step back and looking at the whole picture of the war in Ukraine, how do you think it will come to a conclusion? There are so many different views being put out there about the war and how it may be concluded.
Yeah. So what's happening now in Robotyne is that the Ukrainians have finally achieved something that looks like a breakthrough. And once you've cleared that line, that defensive line, and you can move a significant number of forces through that gap, so to cut off the Russian forces in the west from those in the east, you can then begin to break out, as it were, and move forward. And they will, ideally, they will aim to move towards the Sea of Azov, and then further east, and then to cut off the Russian forces in the west, forcing a surrender. And by moving into that ground occupied to the south of Robotyne, they will be able to directly target the Russian logistics lines, and that will force the Russians to withdraw those logistical bases further back, which will make resupply more difficult, and that will only strengthen the Ukrainian position. What we could see as the Russian-Ukrainian support effort begins to decline, is a collapse of the Russian forces. We know that alcohol consumption is a big problem in the Russian army. Morale is at an all-time low. Leadership is not good. There could be an event where Ukraine achieves a significant breakthrough in a matter of days, which causes a rout and a massive withdrawal or surrender from the Russian forces, and then that will be a major gain. But I think, just a word of caution, I don't think that we can expect a complete victory before Christmas. I think that's too much to ask. This has been a very difficult process. And Zelensky was very clear when he said, look, we have to be careful when we're conducting these offensives, because one of our goals is, at the end of this war, we want enough Ukrainian men left to enjoy the peace. And so they don't want to sacrifice everybody for the sake of recovering this lost ground. It has to be done in a meticulous, carefully pre-planned way, and that's what they're doing. So I expect this war to endure possibly beyond Christmas into the new year, and maybe into next summer. But while all this goes on, and while Ukraine applies continued pressure, there will be pressure at home in Russia, because the amount of casualties Russia has sustained are simply unsustainable.
During a press conference earlier this week, the Ukrainian Defense Minister, Oleksiy Reznikov, said he is expecting other good and interesting things from the West. What kind of equipment has Ukraine found particularly useful, and what are they likely to need more of if they're able to build and break through the progress they've already made on the front line?
Well, it does need superiority number of tanks and IFVs. So if it's going to take ground back, is the one type of vehicle that it will need. The two types of vehicles it will need, tanks and IFVs. And so the more of these we can provide, the better. It also needs more artillery, and in particular, it needs ammunition resupply. And with these three elements, it will be able to take the fight to the enemy. Of course, the other missing element from its combined arms maneuver tactics so far has been air power. And that will now change with the provision of the F-16 combat aircraft. And we know that those are arriving in decent quantities in the near future, although it takes much longer to train a pilot to be proficient using that aircraft, but it does accrue to use a tank. But when they arrive, they will be a game changer, because they will be able to deliver a huge concentration of ordnance on an enemy position very quickly. So that, in combination with artillery, will allow the Ukrainians to retake lost ground.
The US announced yesterday it will send $250 million in weapons and ammunition to Ukraine, but with a potential Donald Trump presidency, how capable is Ukraine of manufacturing its own munitions more in the future with domestic weapons manufacturing?
Well, for the moment, its economy is under real pressure, and manufacturing its own systems, of whatever they are, will be very difficult. Imports will be difficult, and it's very much reliant on NATO and Western countries to keep it resupplied. And for as long as we continue to do that, then it can sustain combat operations against Russia. And by the same token, we should also remember that Russia is having its own problems, and Ukraine's logistical effort is actually much better than Russia's, and that is what will be giving it an advantage at the front. So Russia has been really constrained in bringing fresh units forward, bringing fresh equipment forward. And of course, the equipment it is bringing forward is inferior to that being used by Ukraine. And once this war is over, I expect Ukraine will completely re-equip its armed forces along Western lines, and will look to create highly resilient supply chains, ensuring that it can manufacture its own shells, but also ensuring that it has adequate stocks of ammunition.
One thing that Ukraine has proven itself very adept in doing is making do with the equipment it is given and adapting it in scenarios where perhaps Western allies would never consider being able to use it. and cannibalizing equipment. I just want to show you something from Ukraine's 108th Territorial Defence Brigade.
So obviously this is a rocket artillery system that's been improvised, mounting a very simple system on the back of a truck. And very clever it is too. Of course, not only have they been using rocket systems like this, and of course rockets have been one of the game-changing artillery systems of the conflict. Highly effective, delivering massive firepower very, very quickly. But they've also been using Australian cardboard drones, which are very cheap and cheerful, manufacturing their own homemade drones and other cobbled together equipment types, adding armor to trucks and so on. So these look like 3-inch rockets. I can't quite see what they are, but again, a very simple system. Necessity is the mother of invention in warfare.
Yeah, interesting you say that. I mean, do you think that these makeshift weapons are they speak of desperation or ingenuity?
A bit of both, actually. The problem with makeshift weapons is that they don't have the precision of some of the more modern Western equipment that we're providing. So they will be quite crude in some respects. But so long as they can achieve some kind of accuracy when used to target enemy positions, obviously they will contribute effect.
The former UK Defence Secretary Ben Wallace, who has resigned today, said over the next decade the world will get more insecure and more unstable. Is there anything the West has actually learned from the way Ukraine fights?
People often say, what are we learning that's new? And I say there's little that we're learning that's particularly new apart from the usage of drones. What we're relearning is a lot of very old lessons. And that is, that there is no substitute for mass, and that wars are primarily won on land, not in the air and at sea. And therefore you need to have well-resourced land forces. So I think one of the key things that's going to come out of this is the need to re-equip our army and to make it more credible than it is. I think one of the things we're really going to have to question is whether an army of 73,000 is viable long term. During the Cold War, we had an army of 160,000, or we're well less than half now. And you very much go to war with the army you have, not the army you would ideally like. So that prior preparation and reserve stocks of everything is incredibly important. And what we've done in the last 20 years is we've run down our stocks of everything. And of course, we've given a lot of material to Ukraine, and that has even more damaged our reserves. So we'll need to rebuild those, as well as rebuilding our land forces.
Have you seen anything new in the way warfare is being conducted when you look at the war in Ukraine?
I think the one thing that really is quite radically new is what people are calling algorithmic warfare. And this is where you're using open source data from internet search trends, mobile phone data usage to see concentrations of enemy troops, or to see what people are searching for to work out what the enemy's intent are. That is new, and we're using AI to do that. And that is transformational, because what it can do is it can provide unique targeting data for artillery, and also it can provide deception and electronic warfare opportunities for our own forces. It could even be a way of disabling enemy systems or communications in future. So a very important area and something that we will need to look at in more detail.
I'm just wondering yourself, as somebody who's worked in the defence industry for 20 years, when you look at what's going on in the war in Ukraine, what's stuck out to you in terms of equipment and weaponry? Have you learnt anything new?
I was very nervous about whether the tank would still have a role in warfare. Was warfare going to change in such a way that armor was completely redundant? But that's not been the case. And so everything that we did during the Cold War, which people say was irrelevant to how we would fight in the future, is not in fact irrelevant at all. If you want to retake lost ground, And you have to do that in war. If you're going to win, you have to literally kick the enemy out. You have to be resourced to do that. And we are not at the moment. We are not properly resourced. Just going back to the UK, I mean, we're retiring the Warrior IFV in 2025, and I don't think that's a good thing. I think we need to replace it. I think Boxer's a great vehicle, but it's not an IFV. It's a mechanized infantry vehicle. It's a supporting vehicle. And so I think we'll need to rethink our plans in the light of the Integrated Review refresh and Defence Command Paper refresh. We're expecting the Future Soldier Strategy to be released around DSEI, and I very much hope it will address these points.
And in terms of what you've actually seen the need for in Ukraine, do you see any gaps in the defence industry market that can be filled now? Is there a response to be made?
We need more artillery. We particularly need air defence, and we need to completely reconfigure our forces around drones. So we're going to need to have drones at every level of our armed forces. So we don't need separate drone regiments or UAV regiments. UAVs will need to be incorporated into every kind of unit because they provide vital information. They change the way how that we conduct reconnaissance and save lives. So they're incredibly important. Loitering munitions or armed drones are equally important too, and we just don't have those. And as much as we need drones, we need the ability to counter drones, and that's why air defence has become more important. So a lot of gaps have been identified, particularly on the side of artillery, and of course communications and logistics. I think perhaps, sorry, just to continue, the most important thing to remember is that what has really enabled Ukraine to prevail is excellent logistical support. And we forget that at our peril. And that is what has so damaged Russian units, is that they just have not been able to reinforce success or to reinforce their front line quickly enough to prevent the Ukrainians from taking advantage of their successes. So a lot of relearned lessons.
And how has Ukraine been so successful at its logistical support?
Well, I think it's because it's had a lot of support from the West, but also I think it's a very well-managed army. I mean, I've been astonished by the way in which their soldiers have been led and performed at the front line. I've been very impressed by their planning and obviously their logistical support processes and the way in which they've worked with us and worked independently from us to do what they think is right. And I think, there's been a lot of us teaching the Ukrainians how to conduct things like combined arm maneuvers in the Western style. But after this war is over, we will be going to them and saying, what can you now teach us?
Nicholas Drummond, it's been great talking to you. Thank you so much for your time. You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. My thanks to our producer today, Louis Sykes, and to you for watching. If you'd like to support us, you can subscribe now, or you can listen to Times Radio for the latest news and in-depth analysis, or go to thetimes.co.uk. For now, though, bye-bye.